all sides fancy.
All right. Welcome to episode 7 of the Without Equal podcast. I am Rob McQueen, your host, and I'm joined by my co-hosts and fellow co-founders of Sine Pari, Chris Perry and Steve Cargill. So today we're going to take a quick look and we're going to talk about the state of policing in the United States and really dig into and stick with our theme of commitment and look at how commitment is possibly affecting the way that policing is done in the U.S. and how, as a leader, you could deal with a really complex problem. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to start this conversation off for us. Steve, what you got, man?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, as we continue our conversation about commitment over the course of the month, we touch on policing. And policing in the United States, especially over the past years, has really taken a hit in terms of its ability to ensure commitment among its force. Over the past year, Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund has seen a 24% increase in resignations over the past year, and that's not including early retirements or just plain old retirement in general. So you see that there's a huge draw on the force just from natural attrition. And then also, too, recruiting's taken a hit just because of the atmosphere around policing now. So you see that it's really hard to keep people on the job. And so, what are the second and third order effects of that on the force, on the community, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part. I mean, I can't imagine losing 24% of your force, like a quarter of them gone from early retirements out in a short period of time, is a massive leadership challenge as a whole. But I think if we kind of look at why, I mean, we could kind of extrapolate or, guess a little bit as to why we think this is happening. The narrative, I mean, being a cop has always been a thankless job, I think, for the most part. The narrative and the messaging and kind of the respect they used to hold in the community, or the respect they do hold in some communities now, is degraded quite a bit. So how do you keep someone on the job when they have almost a national level narrative telling them that they are horrible people and they should, that what I think the saying is all cops are bastards. So you have this massive exodus of police. You have this recruiting hammer. I think one of the numbers I heard, I think it was from Brooklyn. I don't have the exact numbers looking at it, but I think it was on their quarterly hiring, they would have 20,000 applicants. And that's dropped to 400 applicants. So when you mix those two things together, how in the hell do you manage that? Because we were talking about this in our pre-call yesterday, and I'm a little at a shock of how would I manage just the personnel problem before I even start managing the issues that are causing that, or the more deep issues. Oh, Chris, you got something to add to that piece?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that are really important with that. When you look at the job of policing, and regardless of your personal opinion, whether it's some, most, or all of the people join that job to protect and serve, it is a job of service. And I would argue one of the most difficult, even, as we relate it to soldiering or anything else, where there is so much autonomy given to people, especially if they're operating by themselves, maybe with a partner, and subjected to daily life and death decisions, possibly. I mean, you don't know. And that's the thing about it, is even, as soldiers and doing some pretty high level stuff, as we all did, we kind of know where the enemy is, and we kind of know what we're getting into, or that we're going to go hit a target. But the life of a police officer, and this is, I've got a lot of friends in law enforcement, both federal as well as some family members in law enforcement. And there's never really an off switch that some of us get to decompress or to make sense of it all. When they go home at night, they're still a cop. People who know them know that they're a cop. It's that is their life, their lifestyle, and it is reflected in everything they do. And again, so they join to. I would suspect, or I would put forth, that they join to serve and to protect the public. So a big part of that is the sentiment of the people who are being protected. We're doing a disservice to it too, as a lot of people leave law enforcement, that we're affecting the community, whether the communities realize it or not, especially ones that may lash out against the police, that we are doing a disservice to those communities as they go unpoliced. That just allows the negative elements that the cops are keeping at bay to grow. And so it has a much bigger effect on society writ large, with the lack of policing, especially in dangerous areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. If policing writ large is lessened, and if you have less respect for an organization such as the police, who are there to serve and protect, then you're simply going to embolden criminals. You're going to embolden criminal activity. You're going to embolden people just to not do right. So it's a huge issue for a community, and that's where people need to start banding together to try to come up with solutions for this.
Well, I think
and people understanding the significance of those decisions that they're faced with on a day-to-day basis, right, is they have to feel supported both from the community and from their senior leadership, that when they are put in these situations that would be difficult for anybody to deal with, that they're going to be supported, and that people will believe they genuinely had the best interest of the community or tried to make the right decision as they did at the time. And this is, this goes to everyone in any kind of leadership role. When your subordinates don't feel like you support them, or they lack the ability to make those difficult decisions, they're going to not make those decisions. And when you're talking about a dynamic environment such as they live in, that's catastrophic for the effectiveness of your organization.
I think, Chris, I want to kind of hit on that one a little bit, because I don't think many people understand what that environment is. Like, we can kind of gloss through it and be like, it's a lot easier to just go hit a house, which I agree. Like, the more difficult and complex operations I've ever been on are the ones where it's like, hey, you're going to navigate through this busy ass city in the middle of the day and, guard a meeting that's happening between two sheikhs, or, take that meeting, and understanding how complex that environment is, because you don't really know who the enemy is at that point. The more deliberate and direct action ones at times are at least easier to manage because you know what you're getting into. It's really difficult, I think, for people to understand like how hard it is to be a good guy with a gun, for lack of a better term, right? Like, it is very hard to take someone's life. And if you talk to any police officers that have too, like, it is a different animal than going to war, right? This is your neighbor. It is a challenging thing. So to be that good guy with a gun and to hold it, you have to have the support of that community. You have to have your boss above you. So you at least know that if you make a mistake, but it was at least the mistake in the right, you thought you were doing the right thing, you have to at least understand you're going to have some leeway. Otherwise, you're not going to do that job. So I have an interesting story to this. So when I was a kid, I grew up in Sun Valley, Idaho. It is a pretty liberal ski town. We had a crazy incident. I want to say I was probably 19 or 20. So just before I joined the military. And there were two homeless guys living at the base of the ski mountain. And there'd been some sort of fight. The neighborhood by the mountain had heard it. Police showed up, came down, and what the cops walked up on was one homeless guy had just murdered another homeless guy. I think it was either a hatchet or a machete. So no shit, it had gone down. And then as the cop draws down on them, the guy gets up and charges him from about 25 to 30 feet away, if I remember the story right. That's not that far away. To everyone else, it sounds good. So he shot the guy 3 or 4 times in the chest, killed him, end of story. If you would have read the newspaper the next day in this town, it was awash condemning this guy for doing just the worst thing in the world. Why didn't he shoot him in the legs? Why didn't he try to wound him? Why didn't he go down this path? Which we all know, having carried a gun and having pointed it and shot it at people, like, you understand how fast that happens and how difficult it is to shoot somebody in the leg while they're running at you trying to kill you with a machete. So I think there's a huge narrative problem and a lack of understanding in the communities that is probably driving a lot of these pieces. I don't know if there's anything. I just wanted to throw that one in there because I think it's hard to understand what they do on a daily basis. But I really do want to kind of tie this back, Chris and Steve, into, okay, so we know we have an issue. We can all kind of identify what the issue is. How in the hell do our leadership manage this issue so we can put a stopgap on what is happening? Because I mean, a 24% drop in policing, that's going to have major impact on the community, right? A major impact. And not just on the people leaving, but you have sub-communities where the police are being very selective on where they actually execute police functions because of that lack of support and that lack of autonomy, Chris, I think, as you said. So what do you guys think? Like, how do we tie this back in? Like, if you're sitting as a police chief or a sheriff in a small town, like, how do you start to address this?
Well, you got to have good communication with the elected officials. You need to be in constant conference with them in order to understand what their stances are, what the needs of their constituents are, what their point of view is, so that way you can objectively communicate that stance to your officers, and so they have an understanding of what leeway they have, essentially.
So I want to cut you up on that because I want to ask you on that piece right there. Okay, so we've all heard some of the narrative from some of the elected officials. So let's say your elected officials are the ones that are like, I don't need you, I want you to go away. Then how do you manage that? Because I mean, that's the easy answer, is just being like, oh, I'm going to talk to the officials and I'll tell them what they is. Like, how do you manage a hostile environment from the civilian leadership?
First, that's like step one, like understanding your operational environment, right? Know what the circumstances are that you're dealing with in terms of those elected officials, because you as the police chief, the boss, that's the next level up. Those are the people that you answer to. So you need to be able to understand that dynamic, be able to communicate that to your subordinates, and have that understanding first of all. And then, like we talked about during the previous podcast, I firmly believe that, commitment certainly can't be generated in an emergency. So this is something that's a long burn, that you need to, develop commitment over layers, commitment to organization, to leadership, to ideals, to each other. Do that over the course of time in order to create a stronger bond. And then, you need to be really objective about how you communicate what that operational environment is to them.
Okay. But I mean, we're at this state. So if you haven't generated the commitment by this point, how do they generate it in a crisis? Chris, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Chris? Like if you're a small town sheriff or a large city sheriff, like what do you do at this point?
Well, it's difficult, especially to speak specifically from the sheriff's point of view, but it does highlight one element too, is the disparate elements between the senior, in this case, elected officials, and the guys doing the job. From what I've seen and from the guys I know that I've talked to in a lot of the law enforcement piece, the breakdown is not at senior law enforcement levels, because the guys at the senior levels have walked in their shoes, right? That leadership level understands what those guys are doing and why they're making the decisions that they made. Problem is when you get people above them that have never done that job assessing right and wrong and whether they make a good decision or not, that have never put themselves in that situation. So part of that goes to being, from a senior leadership perspective, is understanding what your people are going through and trying to put yourselves in those scenarios so that you can understand on a day-to-day basis. Because again, that's just going to lead to fatigue and burnout, right? If you're constantly struggling with your leadership telling you should do something that makes no sense on the ground. And we've seen that to some extent in the military. I think most of us at times in places where the ground truth is often different from the, Starfleet level truth, as we call it. So bridging that gap is critical in creating a functioning organization.
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of taking that part of giving them an idea, I really think sitting in that, I think this is where commitment, thanks to me, or really rings true with me in this, is to what you said earlier, Chris, is why did they become cops in the first place, right? I think the good thing about that is, like, generally they're from that community, right? This is their hometown. They do care about it. So if crime goes up, like, they take that personally because, one, it's their town, it's where their family lives. And two, that's why they signed up, is to protect their community. So I really think that if I was sitting in that saying, I'd kind of do two things. Like, one, I would 100% try to leverage and remind everybody underneath me, like, look, this is why we're doing this. Steve, what you said, this is a slow burn, right? Like, remind it, like, it's not going to be this way forever. I think the best thing about our system is that when things go bad, elected officials are replaced, right? And that's a critical part to be part of your local government. I think we've all seen what an influence local government has, I think more than anyone in the past 2 years. So let your guys know that, hey, there is an end to this, right? There is a piece on the backside of this that's going to go forward. It's not going to be like this forever. And then the other side, like, personally in this like specific scenario, I think I would do something that showed them I was fighting for them. I would try to fight the narrative as hard as humanly possible, right? Like, I don't know if I would hire a PR firm or do what, but I would try to get ahead and at least try to fight and show my guys that, like, I'm going toe to toe with this message for you. I'm not going to let you be the brunt of the joke or, the everyone's enemy until the end. Like, we're going to try to share your experiences and show who you really are and get forward. I think that's how I would kind of approach it.
Yeah, totally agree on that point with the PR there, Rob. I think the next step would be, for the police chiefs and so on to band together to perhaps try to reach out to a PR firm, redraw that narrative, fight against the current narrative. Everybody wants to be a part of an organization that's respected, and so how do you change the view of your organization? Well, you need to communicate how you should be perceived, and that's how you could work with a PR firm. And then also too, not only a PR firm, but working together with, say, the Fraternal Order of Police or with the police unions in order to further exacerbate that messaging out to the community to show, why you are a respected institution, and not only just simply create either a new narrative, fight against a current narrative, but what you do communicate needs to be based in fact. Fact of that, hey, we have made changes. We are making institutional change, cultural change. We're holding each other accountable. And we're not out there flying by the seat of our pants. We're out there doing our due diligence, and we're following the letter of the law and our policies and procedures in order to ensure the safety of our constituency and our community.
Yeah, I think the key part there is accountability, because there is, the narrative exists for the narrative exists for a reason, right? Mistakes have been made, and I think there is a perception at times that the good old boy system tends to protect bad cops, and I think the system in itself, like, there does have to pay that. If you're going to put the narrative out there, you better live up to it. And like you said, you can't put out some BS, and this can't just be a propaganda war of like, trust us, everything's great, and then do the same old things that have led to this kind of, in my mind, completely overblown narrative. But yeah,
and that's the difficulty too, because it is the police are a government organization, so they're subject to budget cuts, training requirements, everything else. And when it's something that's that critical, when you can see so clearly the effects of making a bad decision, that means you need to invest that much more in your people to make sure that they are capable of making the correct decision. And that's the sad thing.
Yeah.
As much as we used to shoot and everything else, I've talked to some friends on police forces where they're allocated, a relative handful of bullets per year to practice with, or, the amount of training based on the amount compared to, I should say, the significance of the decisions that they have to make. They're doing their best to do what they can, but additional resources and training, but they're just subject to the limited, budget cuts and the whims of those above them that decide these things. So I know they're doing their best to operate within what they're given to do.
I wonder if they sit inside of the training environment that DoD does, right? Like, I wonder, did they all get their cyber awareness up this month? I think Steve, we had a conversation once where he's like, I just went through my annual training guidance and my annual training requirements. I have 433 days of annual training requirements. And it's like, so, with that government agency,
right,
how much of, again, that comes down to
the bureaucracy piece.
Yeah.
The AR 350-1 that has, 3 years worth of training requirements that you need to accomplish in 1 year. Yep.
I just want to make sure you're cyber awareness trained. That's the most important thing. Like, if everyone's cyber awareness trained, you understand phishing, and you've listened to your little computer person on the screen tell you how things are supposed to go, everything's going to work out fine. That's all you need. So my real recommendation for police leaders is to institute cyber awareness training for all law enforcement across the country. Online training will be perfect.
Yeah.
Following up on that training idea, I think that one key aspect that could cost very little, but could be hugely beneficial, is just scenario-based training, which doesn't need to involve going to the range and shooting, doesn't involve expending resources necessarily. It just means have a couple of policemen together, maybe consolidate the department, create a scenario, have an audience of cops that aren't participating in the scenario so that they can take notes, pay attention, understand what sort of scenarios they might be able to expect out there in the community, and go through the contingencies. How do you react? What are the contingencies, and what are the proper procedures according to the standard? And then how can you deviate based off the standard? What is within the realm of what is allowable, what is within the law, and how can you be successful in that way? And then go through that iteratively.
Yeah.
So
I went to
right. And we're talking about.
No, go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead, Rob. I was going to say, we're talking, as we break this down, it's internal and external, right? We're talking about PR firms, et cetera, and that's any organization with a public face to it. Using PR firms, we're talking about to highlight successes, focus on the positive, change the external messaging, which of course is critical for police because, like we said, it's a service organization, right, to protect and serve. And that's what they all took an oath to do. And in that aspect, the military and the police, there's very few other organizations where you actually took an oath and they have punitive action over you, and that are also so motivated by patriotism or the desire to serve or the desire to do the right thing. So as it translates to other organizations, if you start seeing mass exodus of your people or whatever, they don't have the same kind of tools that some of the public service organizations and government organizations have to hang on to their people. So it's extremely critical. We're talking about external, and then internal, I think we've kind of identified, is focusing on increasing the capabilities of your people, but also then is re-emphasizing the purpose. Both of the instances we're talking about, military and law enforcement, people did that for the most part, personal reason, a desire to serve, a desire to better their community, whatever it might be. And so emphasizing that purpose, I think, re-emphasizing it or reinvigorating your people's drive to fulfill that purpose is critical in maintaining the morale of your force and the commitment.
Yeah, dude, spot on. And I think on top of that too, on the internal aspect, right? Like a lot of people go from conventional to special operations because you want that higher level of training. It's the same thing with police, right? They want to be trained. They don't want their Barney Fife, 6 bullets to shoot a year to feel comfortable to execute their job and be safe and return home to their families. So I think, Steve, to what you said is, if you provide really good training and they feel like their organization is taking care of them and supporting them, which in high-end training is a good part of that, I think that's a good way too to help, generate that commitment and drive your people forward is give them the tools to be successful. Steve, to your piece on the scenario training, right. I went to a new, what was it? I went to, it was called SimShot. And so I've done a few little, like the simulator training scenarios, and it was actually really good. But I mean, you can do situational based training. The first one I did, I think, was a scantily clad woman in her hot tub that was trying to tell me someone was breaking into her house. And then it turns out she was just trying to kill me and I died, but that's not here nor there. But the big piece of this is, I think, like, what does that training look like? That one, both gives police the confidence and then also feeds that external narrative, right? Like, hey, we've identified the things we need to change, the things we need to fix, and here's how we're training it. Here's how we're doing it. So you kind of hit both sides you're talking about, Chris, that internal and external. At this point, I'd argue internal is really important.
Yeah. If you were to, execute that scenario-based training, record it, you could use that easily for your PR, demonstrating that, hey, we are focusing on true needs of the community by focusing on real situations. And then also too, by executing that training, you show your police officers that you're investing in them and that you're very interested in their safety, their well-being, and that their professional development.
Well, continual progression is key, right? Because that's the thing is, I mean, like you talk about special operations, I know me personally, I don't know if it's everybody writ large, I wanted to go that route to do cooler shit. Now, you kind of make an assumption, I suppose, that you're going to get some better training along the way. But can you imagine, right? If somebody went in to do a more high risk, a more technical mission and was not given additional training, right? I mean, even going through like the qualification course for special forces, they always tell you that's just enough to keep you from getting killed once you get to a team. But you will do most of your learning once you get out there and start employing your craft. And so similarly, like, police go through the police academy training, but I assume that's something similar where it's enough to keep you from getting killed the first day on your job. But the training, the development is a continual process that has to be invested in, and not allowing your organization to reach like a status quo where you think that everything's good, but continually pushing your people to be better.
Yeah, you can't be. Right. Yeah, I had a buddy of mine who he was a Black Hawk pilot in the Guard, and then I think he was a police officer in Minneapolis, so it was a town in Minnesota. But I talked to him after his first day after the academy on there. I was like, how's it going? He's like, dude, I'm really bad at this. He's like, this is really fucking hard. He's got a couple stories, but I think one of these days we'll bring him on and let him tell them because, dear God, like I think he drew his gun on his first day out on the job. I think he drew his gun like 6 times. It gave me another look into it because he was a first buddy of mine that had become a police officer at that point. I was like, oh man, that sounds, and he was in a big city. So it was rough, but man, I don't know. Are there any?
Right. It's that whole armchair quarterback piece too, right? It's so easy to sit back here having no experience, what it's like to get in a gun, what it's like to be in a fight, what it's like to get in a confrontation with somebody and how to keep your cool or whatever it might be, that 99% of people have never had to do, but they're very comfortable judging people for very quickly, the mistakes that are made or anything else, which again, we want to minimize that as much as possible, of course, but we do that through training and progression and trying to expose our people as much as we can.
Yep. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think there's the non-attributional environment, Steve. We've talked about that as a leader, right? Like you have to give your people enough leeway to make mistakes, not catastrophic mistakes, but make mistakes, learn from them, move forward. And that way you can maintain and grow that commitment. But if they don't have that environment to function in, then it's a no-sum game, if you really look at it that way.
Yeah, that's it. And I understand that a lot of police departments, for a lot of like fire departments, a lot of these civil entities, a lot of the training just depends on the motivation of the individuals, whether or not they get together and actually do training because maybe it's not standard or maybe it's not, set on the calendar as such. And it's, just incumbent upon maybe a buddy team or the fire truck team to just be motivated that day and go through some training or some scenarios. So absolutely being able to motivate your people to invest in themselves is key.
Yeah. Damn.
Right. And then the training and selection process too, specifically the selection process, I think, we talk about, and Rob, to your point earlier about the 20,000 to 400, I mean, you select what you can, right? But police, I have no idea of the number of policemen and women that there are in this country, but it's a bunch, right? And so if you need to fill slots, that you have to be careful with the people you select, but I guess my point is maintaining a high standard of the people that you select and trying to weed out any personality traits or anything else that you can do to select the right people for the job also.
Dude, I mean, we're kind of in a conundrum because I think when you look at, what does it say? Like special operations cannot be mass produced in event of a crisis. I think we can all argue that it's done anyway, but to a very reduced capacity or reduced capability. It's kind of the same thing right now. Like
the soft truths, I think we violated 2 or 3 of those
easily,
pretty regularly.
Yeah. On a daily basis. But I think when you look at it from police, right, you have this large, very vocal piece saying the police are fucked up and we need to fix it. So get rid, like defund it and go down. And what happens is you had 20,000 people to pick from before in this one area. Now you have 400. So now you're losing manpower and now you have to fill those slots. So if you think you're going to fill those slots with top candidates, if you think you're going to fill those slots and be able to select as much as you are able to, like if I have to fill 400 slots and I have 20,000 applicants, I could really narrow that down. If I have to fill 400 slots and I only have 400 applicants, it's not going to improve the quality of policing. So I think the leadership challenge to police out there right now is very tough because you have to recruit, you have to fill those slots, you have to have the manpower piece. And at the same time, you have to combat this narrative and reputation and really build it back at the same time, losing possibly a degraded capability in your force. It's terrible for all of us, but I really don't envy the leaders out there. Man, that was a good conversation. I think that was an interesting one. I feel like we're a little all over the place.
It was.
But that's a complicated topic.
Well, it's a complicated topic,
isn't
right?
it, though?
I had another story that I was getting ready to pull out, and I was like, wow, we've been talking for like 40
Do it.
minutes
Send it.
already.
We got time.
So,
I'm not in a rush anywhere.
Yeah, so much more. Oh, no. Well, I was just going to say, like I had an experience once in the Philippines, rolling in, and we had a very high profile mission working with the National Mission Force of the Philippines. And that there's a lot of, I guess I would say, left and right leeway, given the nature of the job. And the team we were going in to replace had a catastrophic failure, more or less, prior to us going in. And I think the team before them as well, because circumstances didn't work out in their favor, I guess I should say. And So going in, eyes were all on us because, again, more or less the equivalent of public perception was against us. They were expecting us to sort of fail because the last two teams had had a really rough go of it. And so that was the thing. Like, I personally, as a team sergeant of that team, I just had to watch what my guys did. Thankfully, I was blessed with a good group of guys. And of course, we had done a lot of training and we were pretty tight going in, which allowed, and we were operating incredibly decentralized. I had a 12-man team broken into, 4 3-man teams strewn across the Philippines, operating pretty much autonomously. So the opportunity to step on it was pretty good over there. And just through investment in the team, of course, as a leader, keeping an eye on the guys, constant communication, and trust in them to make the right decision. We ended up overcoming that and we're pretty successful. But I understand it, like walking into a scenario where people are expecting, or they're looking to highlight your failures. It's difficult. It's daunting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that constant communication is something that you need to maintain if you're a leader. I like to follow Army standard. Have that initial counseling, have quarterly counselings or counselings as frequently as necessary. That way, you've got a standard established two-way communication channel, and then that way there's no ambiguity between you and anybody else in your organization. If you have that communication, it may be forced communication, but it's communication nonetheless. And I've seen a lot of organizations just suffer from a lack of communication, a lot of assumptions made, people just not knowing and maybe just not doing because they don't know and they're afraid to ask. So having those clear communication lines is key. And it's awesome that you had that going for you when you were in the Philippines, because without that, things tend to just stymie themselves. People tend not to have initiative, and then they get lax, and then they make mistakes. So having that communication, especially for police, if that sort of communication doesn't exist, I would highly recommend establishing some formal communication at the very least, and then being able to provide guidance, direction, and motivation in that way.
Yep. The two big things, right? Especially the more autonomously you're working, the more critical are initial guidance being very clear and understandable, and then continuous communication as much as possible to understand where your guys' heads are at, because it's degrees of deviation. If you don't talk to them for a couple of days or a day, they might be a little bit off azimuth. But as you allow those things to progress, if you just say, oh, they're good, and you don't talk to them for a month, by the time you actually do talk to them, they're way off target, right? So it's continual communication and understanding where your people are at.
Absolutely.
I think the communication piece too is it's got to be two ways, right? Like the counseling and everything's great, and some of the Army counseling is good, but I always felt it was very one-way communication. But if you don't have something, that you should always have that formal communication and expectation and like processes. But I really do think there has to be that ability. Like if your subordinates or your people that are working with you don't feel comfortable coming up and talking to you about the things that are fucked up as well, and you don't have that two-way communication, I think it's a key part that kind of rounds that communication circle out. Is like you have to be at a place where they feel comfortable walking in that door and telling you that things are jacked up, right?
You're absolutely right. And yeah, it ties back into what we were talking about earlier of trust in your senior leadership to have your best interest in mind, right?
Yeah.
To know that you have that top cover to make the decisions you need to make, and the trust that even if something is fucked up, you can go in and talk to them and tell them it is, and you guys will figure it out and work on it. Again, as long as it's not egregious or purposeful or something like that. But I mean, a lot of these jobs where people operate in these ambiguous environments, I mean, it's difficult. And a lot of people never explore that, never exposed to it, so they don't understand. But the more autonomous your guys are operating, or the more nebulous the environment, the more you have to have trust, open communication, and responsible leadership.
Yep, absolutely. Man, I don't think that could have closed out any better. That was perfect. It was so damn good. See, Chris, you had to tell the story. It tied it all together perfectly. All right, we'll do the final round robin. Chris, Steve, last comments on this guy, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, I mean, we use this, and I hope everybody understands, we use this police example because it's relevant, and it's something that almost everybody's been exposed to, but this exists in every facet of life, in every organization, and every leadership any institution that has leaders, I mean, you have to worry about this kind of stuff with your people. And again, if you start seeing mass exodus or a drop in morale, I mean, it needs to be addressed quickly and responsibly. And so, again, we don't have all the answers, but we're just trying to promote good dialogue about this stuff. And we'd appreciate any feedback for any of our listeners who've had similar situations. I think it's awesome to be able to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and when you're encountering these sorts of challenges in an institution or an organization, this is where you really need to be a leader and not a manager, because a leader gets to know the people around him, understands the operating environment, is able to dynamically adjust to what's going on in order to develop solutions. And if you're just a manager, you're working according to a checklist. If everything is just checked off that list for the day, things are going well. But when you're doing that, you're ignoring the people. So if addressing these challenges, step up, be a leader, figure out what needs to be implemented, and make that implementation.
Excellent. All right. I just want to say to all of the law enforcement leaders out there who are doing the best they can in this scenario, we're just trying to see it through your eyes and give some leadership advice on the outside, but we definitely are not sitting in your shoes. So good luck and Godspeed to you in navigating this crisis. It is, I don't know if crisis, but it is definitely a crisis of leadership, something you're going to have to deal with. So good luck with that. That's a challenge. All right. So thank you for listening. Again, follow us.
Retrospect.
Yeah, retrospect, right? Thank you for listening. Follow us and subscribe on Spotify, Apple, all the good podcast platforms out there. And then also, if you want to watch us on YouTube or Rumble, and follow our Instagram and social media. But next week, I'm really excited about next week. So our next week podcast, we're going to be joined by Bobby and Lee Tuttle. Bobby is a Special Forces officer and host of Pineland Underground, the official podcast of the JFK Special Warfare Center and School. And Lee and Bobby are also the co-founders of an amazing nonprofit called For Country, where Lee is the current executive director. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to both of them. Should be a good conversation, and join us next week for that. So thank you again for listening to the Without Equal podcast. Cheers.